Halfway through my engagement dinner, the bank called and asked why I had agreed to put my company up as collateral for my sister's $480,000 business loan. There was just one problem. I had never agreed to anything. I had never seen the loan. And I had definitely never signed my name. The woman from the bank asked, "Am I speaking with Emily Warren?" "Yes. We're completing the final review on a commercial loan for $480,000. We need to confirm that you voluntarily authorized Glasshouse and Oak to be used as collateral." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. Glasshouse and Oak was my company. The event property attached to it belonged to me. I had spent 7 years building that business, and I had no idea what she was talking about. I tightened my grip on my phone and looked across the dinner table. My father, Martin, was pouring himself another glass of wine. My mother, Linda, was laughing with one of my aunts. My younger sister, Hailey, was taking pictures of her champagne for Instagram. My fiancé, Noah, was sitting beside me. This was supposed to be our engagement dinner. The bank representative repeated the question. "Ms. Warren, can you confirm that you authorized the guarantee?" "No." My voice came out quieter than I expected. Then I said it again. "No, I can't confirm that. I don't know anything about this loan." The woman's tone changed immediately. "Then please do not sign or approve any additional documents you may receive. I'm placing the application on hold and referring it to our risk department." I asked, "Who is the borrower?" She told me the company name, Haven Muse Media. I knew that name. It belonged to my sister. Hailey had started the lifestyle and social media company about 6 months earlier. I slowly lowered my wine glass. Then I looked at my father. "Do you know anything about a loan for Haven Muse Media?" His hand paused. Just for a second, then he kept pouring. "Tonight is your engagement dinner," he said. "We can talk about business another time." My mother immediately jumped in. "Exactly, everyone's having a nice evening, don't ruin it with work." Those two reactions told me almost everything I needed to know, but it was Hailey who gave away the rest. She looked up from her phone and said, "The bank called you already?" The entire table went quiet. I stared at her. "What do you mean already?" Her face changed. She knew she had said too much. My father sighed. "We were going to tell you after dessert." I looked at him. "Tell me what?" He spoke like he was explaining something completely reasonable. "Hailey's company has a major opportunity to expand. She needs additional capital. The bank wanted more security. Your property is paid down significantly, and your business is stable, so I temporarily included it as collateral." I couldn't believe the word he used, temporarily, as if he had borrowed a folding chair. Not offered up the company I had spent 7 years building to secure somebody else's $480,000 debt. I asked, "Who gave you permission?" His expression hardened. "Emily, don't speak to me like that. Who signed my name?" My mother immediately said, "We're family. There's no reason to make it sound so ugly." Noah had stayed quiet until then. He looked at my father. "Did Emily personally sign the guarantee?" Nobody answered. He asked again, "Did she sign it?" My father turned toward him. "This is a family matter." Noah's voice stayed calm. When someone uses her property to guarantee a loan without her knowledge, it stops being just a family matter. My father's face changed. He had never liked Noah. The reason was simple. Noah was the first person in my life who didn't automatically cooperate when my family wanted something from me. "My name is Emily Warren. I was 34 years old. 7 years earlier, I had left a management job with a hotel group and started my own event planning company. A year after that, I bought an abandoned greenhouse outside Denver. It had once been part of an old botanical property. The roof leaked. The heating barely worked. Half the glass was cracked. When I first brought my father to see it, he stood in the doorway and said, "You paid money for this?" I had. I used 6 years of savings. I took out a business loan. I sold part of my investment portfolio, then I slowly rebuilt the place. It became Glasshouse and Oak during the week. Companies rented it for brand events and dinners. On weekends, we hosted weddings. During the holidays, businesses booked it months in advance for parties. The first year was brutal. The second year, we finally made a profit. By the fourth year, couples were booking Saturday dates almost a year ahead. At that point, I had 15 full-time employees and a much larger seasonal staff during busy months. People outside my family saw me as the successful daughter. Inside my family, I had never been the important one. That position belonged to Hailey. She was 5 years younger than me. Beautiful, outgoing. Funny, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of it. When I brought home straight A's as a kid, my father asked why I hadn't gotten a perfect score in math. When Hailey brought home 3 B's, my mother said grades weren't a good measure of creativity. I worked at a coffee shop during college. After Hailey graduated, my parents paid for a 6-week trip through Europe. I drove my first car for 9 years. By the time Hailey bought her 3rd car, my mother told me, "She makes content. Image matters." For years, I told myself none of it bothered me. I was the older sister. I was more independent. I could handle more. That was how I slowly became my family's backup bank account. It didn't happen with one huge request. It happened in small pieces. Hailey couldn't pay off a credit card. I helped. My mother wanted to remodel the kitchen. I covered part of it. My father's company had a cash flow problem. I loaned him money. Hailey's first business failed. I paid the final 2 months of rent on her office. Every single time they told me the same thing. Just this once. Eventually I learned that sometimes the most dangerous role in a family isn't being the weakest person. It's being the person everyone believes will never fall apart. Because once people decide you can handle anything, they start treating your strength like it belongs to everyone. I met Noah 4 years earlier. Glass House in Oak was expanding, and I wanted to turn an old warehouse next door into a smaller reception space. An architect recommended Noah Reed. He was 37 and specialized in renovating historic buildings. I didn't like him very much the first time we met. He had been inside the warehouse for maybe 15 minutes when he said, "Your budget isn't enough." I asked, "How far off am I?" "At least 20%. I told him 2 other firms said my budget was fine. He shrugged. "Then you should hire them." I almost did. It turned out he was right. The electrical system was much worse than anyone expected. The roof needed structural reinforcement. If I had used one of the cheaper proposals, I would have been hit with major change orders halfway through construction. Noah didn't convince me to spend more. He actually removed several expensive design ideas I wanted but didn't need. In the end, the project came in only 3% over budget. That was how we got to know each other. Noah wasn't a dramatic romantic. For our first date, he took me to a regular Mexican restaurant. On our second date, he was 12 minutes late because of an issue at a construction site. The moment he sat down, he apologized. No excuses, no long explanation. That small thing stayed with me. I had spent most of my life adjusting my schedule around my family, so being treated like my time mattered felt unusual. Noah and I dated for 3 years. The previous winter, he proposed inside the original greenhouse at Glass House in Oak. No audience, no photographer hiding nearby. Just us. I said yes. But our first serious argument after getting engaged was also because of my family. Hailey wanted to use Glass House in Oak for a brand launch for free. The normal price for the event she wanted would have been close to $20,000. I told her I could give her the venue at cost. She went home and cried to my mother. That evening, Mom called me. "Your own sister wants to use the place for one night and you're charging her." Eventually, I gave in. I waived the venue fee. When Noah found out, he asked, "Does she have money for a photographer?" "Yes." "Does she have money for alcohol?" "Yes." "Influencers?" "Yes." "So she has a budget for everyone except you?" I didn't answer. He didn't insult Hailey, he just said, "Emily, you're allowed to help your family. But helping has to be something you choose. If you're not allowed to say no, it isn't help." At the time, I thought he was making too much of it. Sitting at my engagement dinner months later, I finally understood exactly what he meant. My family no longer believed I should simply give Hailey free access to my property. They believed I didn't even need to know before they used it. My father was still trying to explain the loan. He said $480,000 wasn't some impossible amount. Hailey's company was about to grow. Once she secured new investors, she could pay the loan down early. I asked, "What happens if she can't?" My mother said, "Why do you always have to assume the worst?" I looked at Hailey. "How much profit did your company make last year?" Her face turned red. "That's none of your business." I almost laughed. "You're using my company as collateral, and your finances are none of my business." She immediately said, "I didn't force Dad to do anything." My father hit the table with his hand. "That's enough." Then he looked at me. "Emily, you already have more than enough. Hailey just needs an opportunity. You're her sister. What's wrong with helping her?" I had heard some version of that sentence my entire life. "You're the older sister. You can afford it. You're doing fine. She only needs a little help." I looked at him and asked, "Who forged my signature?" The table went silent again. My father's face turned cold. "Don't use words like forged." "What word would you prefer? You've signed company authorization forms before. I still had a digital copy of your signature." I felt cold all the way down my back. "So it was you." He said nothing. My mother started crying, not because my father had used my signature. She was upset because I had made the engagement dinner uncomfortable. "There are relatives here," she said. "Did you really have to bring private family issues into this?" I looked at her and suddenly felt exhausted. Noah gently touched the back of my hand under the table. He wasn't pulling me away. He wasn't telling me what to do. He was just reminding me he was there. I picked up my purse. Then I told everyone, "The dinner is over." My father stood. "Walk out that door and see what happens." That sentence used to work on me. It worked when I was a teenager. It still worked when I was in my 20s. At 34, I kept walking. Noah followed me out of the restaurant. I didn't start shaking until we reached the parking lot. I wasn't crying. My hands just wouldn't stop trembling. Noah asked if I wanted to stay at his place. I shook my head. "I want to go back to my apartment." Okay. He drove me there. When we reached my door, he stopped. I asked, "You're not coming in?" He looked at me. "Do you want me to?" For some reason, the question surprised me. I was used to people telling me what they needed. Very few people asked what I wanted. "Yes," I said, "I want you to stay." So he did. I barely slept that night. At 7 the next morning, I called the bank. Then I called my company attorney. By 10, I was sitting across from Julia Pierce, an attorney who specialized in commercial contracts and financial disputes. After I explained what happened, her first question wasn't, "How could your father do that?" She asked, "What company records can your father access?" That question scared me more than anything else. For 7 years, I had treated my family like family. I had never treated them like a business risk. My father used to own a small building materials company. During the early years of Glasshouse and Oak, he helped me connect with a few suppliers. For a while, I even let him review some maintenance estimates. There could still be old contracts on his computer, copies of my electronic signature, tax identification numbers, old business records. Julia told me to reset everything immediately: system passwords, vendor access, accounting permissions, digital signatures. Then she had me pull business credit reports and search for any liens or guarantees tied to my company. At 4 that afternoon, she called. We found something else. 6 months earlier, an equipment leasing company had recorded a business security agreement. The amount was $78,000. The company receiving the equipment, Haven Muse Media, my sister's business, the guarantor, Glasshouse and Oak. I knew nothing about it. I asked, did they already receive the money? It wasn't a cash loan. It covered photography equipment, live stream equipment, and a company vehicle. Who signed? Julia paused. You did. Except I hadn't. Now the $480,000 application wasn't the first time my family had used my name. It was simply the first time I caught them. That night, I called Noah. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't stay at the venue alone tonight." "Why?" "Because your family has used your identity twice without permission." "I don't know what else they think they're entitled to do." That upset me. "They're my parents, Noah. They're not criminals." He didn't argue. He just said, "I hope I'm wrong." The next morning, my mother started calling. I ignored the first 6 calls. I answered the 7th. "Why did you have a lawyer contact your father?" "Because he used my signature." "He's your father." I paused. "So?" There was silence. I don't think my mother had ever imagined that sentence could have a response. "He did it for the family," she finally said. "Which family?" "Why does helping Hailey's company require risking mine?" She told me Hailey had been struggling emotionally. Her brand had stopped growing, an investor had backed out. She was anxious. If her funding disappeared too, Mom said Hailey might completely fall apart. And the worst part, my first reaction was guilt. Even after they had used my name. Even after they had risked my business. A part of my brain still asked, is Hailey okay? Am I being too hard on her? Should I wait before doing anything? That was how deeply this pattern had been trained into me. I hung up. Then I sat alone in my office for 20 minutes. Noah came by later. He didn't ask if I had changed my mind. He brought me coffee. I looked at him and asked, if I end up helping them anyway, "Are you going to think I'm stupid?" "I'm not going to make the decision for you." Then he paused. "But if we're really going to get married, I need to know something." "What?" "Can our future have a front door?" I frowned. I don't understand. "Not everybody who loves you should automatically have a key." That was when I cried, because he wasn't really talking about money. He was talking about my entire life. For 34 years, anyone in my family with a problem could walk straight into my time, my home, my finances, my emotions. No warning, no permission, no concern about what I had going on. If they needed something, I was supposed to make room. 3 days later, Hailey made everything worse. She posted a video online. She never said my name, but anyone who knew our family knew exactly who she meant. She sat in her car crying. She said she had recently experienced a devastating betrayal from someone she loved. She said some women became successful and forgot the people who had been there before the money. She said she had been trying to build a brand for women only to have someone who was jealous of her youth and popularity intentionally cut off her funding. The video passed 200,000 views. People flooded the comments with support. Someone asked, "Is this about your sister?" Hailey liked the comment. That evening, Glasshouse and Oak received dozens of 1-star reviews. People accused us of attacking female entrepreneurs. Others called me cold and greedy. Some people even found photos of Noah and me. The next morning, his architecture firm received complaints too. People accused him of manipulating me so he could control my property. I was furious. I barely slept. The next morning, I called Hailey. It was the first time I had contacted her since finding out about the loan. "Are you deleting the video?" "I never said your name." "You liked the comment naming me." People guessed, "Hailey, your company used my signature to get $78,000 in equipment, and now you're trying to borrow another $480,000 against my company. Are you sure you want this conversation happening online?" She went quiet. Then she said, "Are you threatening me?" "No. I'm telling you that for the first time. I'm not planning to protect you from the truth." She hung up. An hour later, the video disappeared. But the damage had already started. 2 corporate clients emailed us asking about the controversy. One couple who had been about to sign a wedding contract put everything on hold. That was when I learned family members don't only have access to your money. If you let them, they can use the word family to attack the reputation you spent years building. That night, Noah and I had our biggest fight. I asked, "Did you always think my family was terrible?" "That's not the point." "Then what is?" "The point is that every time they hurt you, you wait until the last possible second before allowing yourself to say no." I felt attacked. "You don't know what it's like to grow up in a family like mine." "You're right." He didn't argue. "I don't. But Emily, I also can't marry you and watch the same people crash into our life every few months while you keep opening the door." I froze. "So you don't want to marry me anymore?" He was quiet for a few seconds. "I want to marry you, but I don't want the wedding to become another project where you prove something to your family." "What does that mean?" "It means I think we should pause the wedding plans." That hurt more than the call from the bank. Because I loved him, and at that moment all I could think was, my family finally ruined this too. I asked, "Are you punishing me?" "No. I'm waiting for you to decide what kind of life you actually want." He didn't break up with me. He didn't ask for the ring back. We simply stopped planning the wedding we had scheduled for 6 months later. That night, I went home alone and cried for hours. For the first time in my life, I hated Hailey. I hated my parents. Then a few hours later, I started hating myself. Why hadn't I stopped this years ago? Why did I always wait until things became unbearable? 4 days later, Julia told me the bank had formally suspended the $480,000 loan. The equipment leasing company had also opened an internal investigation. If the signatures were confirmed to be unauthorized, they would pursue the people who had actually submitted the paperwork. I immediately asked, could Hailey go to jail? Julia looked at me. "Emily, stop worrying about everyone else's consequences before we even finish identifying what they did." It sounded obvious. It still took me a long time to understand it. 2 weeks later, we finally got a clear picture of Hailey's finances. From the outside, Haven Muse Media looked successful. More than 200,000 followers. A beautiful office, professional videos, events, brand collaborations. The reality was completely different. In 18 months, Hailey had lost almost $310,000. My parents had already given her more than $170,000. They sold part of their retirement investments. My father pulled cash out of his business. And one detail shocked me more than the rest. They had drained an account they had originally set aside for retirement medical expenses. The $480,000 loan was not going to fund some incredible expansion. A large portion of it was meant to cover old debt, equipment balances, office rent, several nearly maxed out business credit cards, and about $90,000 was supposed to go back to my father's company. That meant my father had used his own company to rescue Hailey. Then he planned to use my company as collateral for a larger loan and pay part of the new money back to himself. Everyone was pouring money into the same hole. I was simply the only person who didn't know how deep it was. I asked Julia, why didn't they just ask me? Because if they asked, you might have said no. That hit me. They didn't assume I would agree. They knew I might refuse. That was exactly why they skipped me. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. I didn't call first. My father wasn't home. Neither was Hailey. My mother was alone in the kitchen. When she saw me, she looked relieved. She probably thought I had finally come to my senses. She poured me coffee. "I knew you weren't really going to take this too far." I sat down. "Did you know about the $170,000? Her smile disappeared. I put the financial records on the table. She stared at them for a long time. Then she started crying this time. It wasn't a performance. She was genuinely afraid. She told me that after Hailey's first business failed, Hailey had gone through a terrible emotional period. For weeks, she barely left the house. My parents became convinced that another failure would break her. So they kept helping. Then helping became more money. Then more. Then more. I asked, why did nobody ever worry about whether I could handle everything? My mother said, "You're different." There it was again. "You're different. You're strong. You don't need help. You've always been independent," she said. "Hailey is more sensitive." I stared at her. "So because I can carry weight, you just keep putting more on me?" She didn't answer. Then I asked, "Did you know Dad used my signature?" She looked down. That was enough. She knew. Maybe not every detail, but she knew. I stood to leave. She grabbed my hand. "Emily, don't do this. What your father did was wrong. But if the bank goes after him, how is he supposed to deal with something like that at his age?" I pulled my hand away. "What about me? If Hailey defaults on $480,000, what happens to my company? What happens to my 15 employees? What happens to the couples who paid deposits for weddings? What happens to the corporate clients who booked events? She had no answer. I told her, from now on you do not make decisions for me. Not about my money. Not my company. Not my property. Not my signature. Nothing, she cried harder. Are we still a family? I looked at her. If we can only be a family when I keep giving in, then I don't know. Then I left. 3 weeks later, I got a completely unexpected phone call. It was from the accountant who had handled my grandmother Evelyn's estate. Grandma Evelyn had died 9 years earlier. We had been very close. She was part of the reason I had been brave enough to buy the old greenhouse in the first place. When she was younger, she owned a flower shop. She used to tell me, if you love something, learn how to make it support you. The accountant contacted me because while Julia was tracing old business funding, she found an old transfer. I had always believed my parents gave me $30,000 during the hardest year of my startup. They had reminded me of it for years. Every time I refused something for Hailey, I heard, "Don't forget who gave you $30,000 when your business was dying." I carried that debt emotionally. I thought they had saved me when I needed help most. The accountant told me the money had never belonged to my parents. It came from a trust my grandmother created for me. Before she died, she knew I wanted to start a business. She was worried my parents might pressure me to divide the money equally with my sister. So she arranged for the money to go through a family management account before being transferred to me. My parents had only been responsible for notifying me. Later, they started telling the story as if the money had come from them. I sat in the accountant's office completely stunned. It wasn't really about $30,000. It was about the fact that the deepest guilt I had carried for years was built on a lie. I thought my parents had rescued me, so I kept paying them back emotionally, again and again. But the person who had actually helped me was my grandmother. My parents had simply taken credit. The accountant also had a scanned copy of a letter Grandma Evelyn left for me. It was short. She wrote, "Emily, if anyone ever tells you that your success belongs to them because they once helped you, remember this. Help does not purchase ownership." I read it 3 times, then I cried right there in the office. Not because I was sad, because suddenly I felt lighter. That evening I texted Noah. "Are you free?" He arrived 20 minutes later. We sat inside the empty main hall at Glass House in Oak. There was no event that night. Only half the lights were on. I handed him the letter. He read it. Then he stayed quiet. I asked, "Do you think I should have figured this out years ago?" "No. You just finally got a piece of evidence you were ready to believe." I looked at him. "I was afraid you really didn't want me anymore." "Emily, I didn't pause the wedding because I stopped wanting you. I paused it because I didn't want to marry a version of you who was still disappearing every time your family needed something. That made me cry even harder." He continued, "I want you to choose me, but I need you to learn how to choose yourself too." That night, we still didn't pick a new wedding date, and for the first time, that felt okay. I stopped trying to force everything back to normal. Instead, I dealt with the actual problem. Every company permission was rebuilt. My father was removed from every vendor and property contact list. Contracts above a certain amount required 2-person verification. We replaced the electronic signature system. Accounting access was completely reorganized. Then I called a meeting with my staff. I didn't give them all the family details. I told them the company had discovered unauthorized financial guarantees. I told them the issue was being handled. No employee was losing a job. No client contract was at risk. When I finished speaking, my operations manager, Sarah, raised her hand. "What do you need from us?" I remember staring at her. She didn't ask, "How did you let your family do this?" She asked, "What do you need?" That was the difference. A month later, my father asked me to meet. He said he wanted to resolve everything. We met in a hotel coffee lounge. When I arrived, it wasn't just him. My mother was there. Hailey was there, and there was a lawyer I had never met. Several documents were already on the table. I knew immediately this wasn't a normal conversation. My father said, "None of us wants this to keep getting worse." Hailey looked exhausted. No makeup. No phone in her hand. My father slid a document toward me. Family settlement agreement. He said if I signed, the entire problem could end. I read the first 2 pages. The agreement said that I acknowledged the earlier business guarantees had been verbally authorized within the family. In exchange, they would abandon the $480,000 loan application. I almost laughed. Their idea of settling the fraud was for me to sign a document saying it had never been fraud. I closed the folder. "I'm not signing this." My father's expression changed. "You didn't even finish reading it." "I read enough. If you don't sign, the bank is going to continue investigating. The equipment company could pursue legal action. Hailey's company could collapse." I looked at my sister. She finally spoke. "Do you really want to watch me lose everything?" I asked. "Why does your company failing become something I did to you? Didn't you make the business decisions?" Her eyes filled with tears. "You've always looked down on me. That surprised me." "What are you talking about? You were always better at everything." "Every time Mom and Dad praised me, I knew you were standing there thinking it was ridiculous." I didn't say anything, she kept going. You have your business. You have Glass House and Oak. You have Noah. You have everything. I finally built something of my own. Why can't you just help me? For the first time I understood that we had both been hurt by the same family, just in opposite directions. My parents taught me that my value came from how many problems I could solve. They taught Hailey that her value came from how many people would solve problems for her. So I became better and better at carrying consequences. She never learned how to carry any. I told her, I can help you find a financial advisor. I can connect you with a restructuring attorney. I can introduce you to people who actually know how to rebuild a brand. She looked up for a second. There was hope on her face. Then I added, but I'm not paying your debt, and I'm not guaranteeing it. Her expression turned cold again. Then how is that helping me? I shook my head. That's our biggest problem. To you, it only counts as help if I take the consequence away from you. I stood. You can deal with your problems. My attorney will deal with mine. I walked out of the coffee lounge. My father followed me into the hotel lobby. He called my name. Then he said, if you let this go into a legal investigation, our relationship is over. I turned around. Years earlier, that would have stopped me immediately. That day, I only asked, so our relationship depends on whether I'm willing to protect you from what you did? He had no answer. I left. 2 months later, Haven News Media shut down. Not because of me, because it already couldn't afford to operate. Hailey closed the office, returned the company vehicle, sold part of the equipment. Her fiancé left too. I assumed all of that would make her hate me even more. Then one night, almost 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Hailey. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. I think I lost everything. For once I didn't immediately comfort her, I waited. Then I asked, where are you? She was sitting in the parking lot outside her old office. I got in my car. That was the first time since setting boundaries that I chose to go help her. My mother didn't ask me. My father didn't order me. I chose it. When I found Hailey, she was sitting in her car with swollen eyes. She told me her former fiancé had said something before leaving. I fell in love with the person you showed everyone. I don't know who the real you is. That sentence had broken her. She looked at me. Is that how you've always seen me too? Sometimes she cried harder. Then for the first time in my life, she said, I don't know how to become anyone else. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel like she was finally getting what she deserved. I felt sad, because for a second, I wasn't looking at 30-year-old influencer Hailey. I was looking at the 16-year-old girl who failed a test and watched our parents immediately call the teacher to fix it. She had never learned how to fail. Every time failure showed up, somebody removed it. So she grew older without developing the ability to survive consequences. I told her, you can start learning now. She asked, will you help me? Yes. Then I added, but I won't do it for you. This time, she didn't yell at me. We didn't magically repair our relationship that night. Real life doesn't work like that. For the next 6 months, we had good weeks and bad weeks. She started applying for normal jobs. She failed her first interview and called me to complain. I listened. I didn't call anybody to get her hired. The second company gave her an entry-level content position. The salary was much lower than the lifestyle she had been used to. She almost rejected it. Then she took it. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment, sold many of her designer things. 1 month, she texted me, I just paid every single bill myself. I replied, good. She texted back, that's it? Just good? I wrote, they were your bills. She sent an eye roll emoji, but I knew she was smiling. My father's situation wasn't as easy. The bank confirmed the guarantee had never been authorized by me. The equipment company also found problems with the electronic signature. Because the amounts were significant and there were multiple documents, there was a formal investigation. My father didn't spend years in prison. The case eventually ended through a plea agreement, repayment, and financial restrictions, but he lost the supplier business he had run for years. His partners no longer trusted him. He had to sell assets to cover debt. My mother finally had to face the real state of their finances too. They moved out of the large house they had lived in for almost 20 years and rented a normal apartment. For the first time, I didn't pay for their move. My mother asked once. I said, you can afford a normal moving company. She wasn't happy, but she never asked again. My father was harder. He barely spoke to me for almost a year. No birthday text. No Christmas call. Nothing. At first, I cared more than I wanted to admit. That first Christmas, I kept checking my phone until almost 11 at night. No message came. Noah was sitting beside me. I finally asked, do you think he still loves me? Noah looked at me. I don't know. It was an honest answer. He didn't tell me what I wanted to hear just to make me feel better. He took my hand. But you don't have to sacrifice something else to test the answer. I remembered that. Noah and I didn't restart the wedding plans right away. Instead, we went to premarital counseling. At first, I felt embarrassed. I thought counseling was only for couples whose relationships were already failing. I was wrong. We talked about money, family, children. What would happen if my parents needed care later in life? What would happen if Hailey had another major crisis? How much help we were comfortable giving. Most importantly, we talked about what our life would actually mean after marriage. Noah never asked me to cut off my family. He only said, if somebody needs help, we can talk about it, but the decision has to be ours. That was the first time marriage stopped feeling like moving from one family into another. It wasn't replacing my parents with a husband who would make decisions for me. It was two adults creating rules together. About a year later, we decided to get married again. The wedding would still be at Glass House and Oak, but this time I didn't give my family any role in planning it. Hailey asked, "What do you need me to do?" "Show up on time." She laughed. "That's it?" "That's it." My mother didn't choose the flowers. She didn't see the menu in advance. She didn't arrange the seating chart. At first, it bothered her, then she adjusted. My father didn't immediately tell me whether he would attend 3 weeks before the wedding. He sent a short text. "I'll be there." I stared at it for a long time, then I replied, "Okay." The morning of the wedding, I was surprisingly calm. I thought I would be nervous. I wasn't. Sunlight filled the greenhouse roof at Glass House and Oak. When I bought the building 7 years earlier, many of those glass panels had been broken. Cold air came through the walls in winter. Rain leaked inside. Now the main hall was filled with flowers and green plants. I stood in the small upstairs room looking down at it all. I suddenly remembered the first time my father saw the place. "You really think this is going to make money?" At the time, I wasn't completely sure. I only knew I wanted to try. Eventually, I learned that most important things in life don't come with guarantees. Businesses don't, relationships don't. All you can really know at the beginning is whether the choice belongs to you. Hailey wore a simple blue dress that day. She didn't live stream anything. She barely took pictures. Before the ceremony, she came upstairs. She handed me a small box. Inside was one of Grandma Evelyn's old brooches. "Mom found it," she said. "She thought Grandma would want you to wear it today." My eyes immediately filled with tears. Hailey stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Emily, I really used to think that if you didn't help me, it meant you didn't love me. I know. Now I think sometimes you refusing to help me was the first time anybody treated me like an adult." I never expected to hear that from her. I hugged her. Not every problem disappeared, but that was the first hug between us that wasn't connected to something she needed from me. My father came to the wedding too. He sat near the back. We didn't have a private conversation until late in the reception. He walked over while I was standing near the greenhouse doors. "The place looks good," I smiled. "You definitely didn't say that 7 years ago." He gave a small smile. Then he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "What I did with those documents, I'm sorry." It was the first real apology I had ever received from him. No explanation about Hailey, no speech about family. Just, "I'm sorry, I didn't immediately tell him it was okay," because not every apology needs to be erased with "it's okay." I only said, "I heard you." He nodded. Then he walked away. For that day, it was enough. After most of the guests left, Noah and I sat on the steps outside the greenhouse. I had taken off my heels because my feet hurt. He looked at me and said, "So how does Mrs. Reed feel? So far? Pretty good," he laughed. Then he asked, "Do you regret that we postponed this for a year?" I thought about it. No. If we had gotten married right after the first engagement dinner, part of me would always have believed Noah had rescued me from my family. But that wasn't what happened. Noah didn't rescue me. Julia didn't rescue me. Hailey changing later didn't rescue me. What actually changed my life was that I finally became willing to pay a price I had always been terrified to pay. Disappointing people. For most of my life, I was terrified of disappointing my mother, my father, my sister. If one of them was unhappy with me, I immediately checked myself. Am I being selfish? Am I not doing enough? Should I give a little more? Eventually, I understood something. When an adult starts setting boundaries, people who benefited from having no boundaries are going to be disappointed. That does not mean you did something wrong. Sometimes it only means they are finally learning that your time, money, and energy are not unlimited. Years later, when I think about that engagement dinner, the $480,000 isn't even the part that hurts most. Neither is the forged signature. What hurts is that when my family used my business, nobody thought they needed to ask me, because in their minds, my answer had already been decided. Emily will help. Emily can handle it. Emily won't stay angry. Emily will eventually forgive us. It took me a long time to change that automatic answer. Now when someone asks me, if your family needs help, should you help them? My answer is still yes. Sometimes I still help my mother. I still have dinner with Hailey. If my father became seriously ill, I wouldn't pretend I didn't know. But helping someone and being used by someone are completely different things. Real help requires one thing. You have to be allowed to say no. If saying no makes someone threaten you, insult you, attack your character, or tell you that you don't deserve to be part of the family anymore, then what they wanted may never have been help. They wanted control. I also learned that strength doesn't mean solving every problem for the people you love. Sometimes strength means watching someone you love make a mistake, knowing you could fix it immediately, and still letting them carry the consequence, because if you remove every consequence for them, they never learn how to live. Hailey never returned to being a lifestyle influencer. She worked at that small company for 2 years. Eventually, she and 2 friends opened a tiny content studio. When she was about to sign the lease for their first office, she sent me the contract. I asked, "Do you want me to look at it?" "No. I already had an attorney review it. I just wanted to tell you I didn't let Dad sign anything this time." I laughed for a long time. Eventually, she met a good man too. The first time she wanted to bring him to Glasshouse and Oak, she texted, "Can I bring someone by?" Such a normal question. But I remembered the sister who once acted like my property automatically belonged to her. People really can change, but sometimes they only change after the people around them stop making it comfortable to stay exactly the same. My relationship with my mother changed too. She started family counseling. Eventually, she admitted that constantly rescuing Hailey wasn't only favoritism. It was fear. She believed that if one child seemed fragile, a mother had to save her from every painful thing. And because I looked stable, she kept adding more responsibility to me. "I always thought you didn't need me," she said. I answered, "I just never felt safe saying I did." We both cried. That conversation didn't erase 30 years of problems, but for once, we were talking about something other than money, other than who owed what to whom. We were talking about what had actually happened to us. Noah and I had a daughter 3 years after we married. When she was 2, Hailey came over with 2 stuffed animals in different colors. I asked why she bought 2. She said, "If I have a kid someday, I don't want them fighting over the same one." I laughed and told her she was planning way too far ahead. But that night, after my daughter was asleep, I kept thinking about it. I don't know if I'll be a perfect mother. Probably not. Noah won't be a perfect father either. But there is one thing I know I don't want to repeat. I never want my daughter to believe she has to be useful to deserve love. I don't want her to think obedience is the price of belonging. I don't want her to think endless sacrifice is what makes someone a good daughter. If she grows up to be stronger than the people around her, I want her to know that strength belongs to her. It isn't permission for everyone else to assign her more weight. And if she grows up feeling fragile at some point, I will support her. But I hope I'm brave enough to let her learn how to carry things too, because loving someone does not mean removing every heavy thing from their life. Real love says you can stand on your own. And when you're tired, I'll help you for a while, but I will not keep you from learning how to walk because I'm afraid you might fall. That $480,000 loan was never approved. My company survived. Glasshouse and Oak eventually opened a second location. Noah's architecture firm designed part of the expansion, and this time I paid his company the full professional fee under a normal contract. Someone once joked, "You two are married and you still charge each other?" I said, "Of course." Years earlier, I thought real closeness meant you didn't need clear lines. Now I think clarity can be one of the deepest forms of respect. His work has value. Mine does too. His responsibilities belong to him. My choices belong to me. We can share almost anything. But sharing should happen because both people know about it and both people agree. That is true in marriage. And it is true in families. I used to think real love meant having no boundaries. Now I know relationships without boundaries often make one person bigger and bigger, while the other person slowly disappears. Healthy love does not tear down every boundary. Healthy people stand outside the door, they knock, they wait. If you say, "Come in," they come in. If you say, "Today isn't a good day," they don't stop loving you. That is what safety means to me now. Not knowing that nobody will ever leave, knowing I don't have to keep sacrificing pieces of myself to make them stay. It took me 34 years to learn that, and the lesson wasn't cheap. I almost became responsible for $480,000 of debt that wasn't mine. My wedding was postponed. My family almost completely fell apart. There were plenty of nights when I sat alone in my car and cried. But if that was the price of finally learning the lesson, I'm still glad I learned it. Because now, when I walk into Glasshouse and Oak and watch my staff prepare another wedding, when I see Noah on the other side of the room talking to an engineer, when Hailey sometimes stops by with coffee, I don't automatically ask myself, what do they need me to do? I ask, what do I want to do today? One small word changed my entire life. Want. So if there is someone in your life who keeps telling you, you have more, so you should give. You're stronger, so you should carry it. We're family, so you're not allowed to say no. I hope you remember this. Your strength is a good thing. It is not a license for other people to use you without limits. Your kindness is not a contract saying you must always give in. And someone who truly loves you will never require you to keep giving up your own life just to prove that you care. People worth keeping will respect your yes, and they will also respect your no. I used to believe boundaries would make me lose my family. Instead, boundaries helped me see the difference between the people who wanted to stay because they loved me and the people who wanted to stay because they could use me. Noah taught me something else too. Healthy love is not a man rushing in and defeating everyone who hurt you. He doesn't live your life for you. He doesn't make all your decisions. He doesn't use your weakest moment to make you dependent on him. He simply stands beside you. And when you're scared, he reminds you, this is your life. You get to choose. Then he respects the decision because it is truly yours. On our wedding night, Noah asked if I was ready to go home. I looked back at Glasshouse and Oak, the old greenhouse I had rebuilt piece by piece. When I bought it, parts of it were broken. People called it a bad investment. For years, I thought the building represented my success. Eventually, I realized it represented something else. Something can be broken without becoming worthless. You can repair it, replace the damaged pieces, strengthen the structure, build something new inside it, but once it is rebuilt, you have to keep the key in your own hand. I reached for Noah's hand, let's go home. And for the first time in my life, when I said the word home, I wasn't talking about a building. I was talking about a life that finally had enough room for me to exist without disappearing.